When I first heard the sound of the gate slamming shut, I didn't realize it would be the moment everything changed. The sun was bleeding across the horizon that morning, throwing long orange streaks across the dry earth of my ranch, and the air was still, too still. Out here, miles from the nearest subdivision, you'd think peace would be easy to find. But even in the quiet, trouble has a way of finding you, especially when that trouble wears a pressed polo shirt and calls himself Mr. President. I remember standing there by the fence line, watching a figure pacing near my cattle pen. Clipboard in hand, HOA logo stitched perfectly into his cap. He looked so out of place, like a city man trying to play cowboy, but he walked my land like he owned it. No warning, no permission, just bold entitlement. That was the moment I knew this wasn't going to end with a simple conversation. They said my land technically fell under their jurisdiction, that I'd agreed to certain rules I never signed for. At first, it was petty stuff. Letters about my fencing, a warning about the color of my barn, even a demand to remove my cattle because they were unsightly. It was laughable, until it wasn't. Because when people with a little power get a taste of control, they'll come for everything you built, and they did. One fine at a time, one visit after another. Each knock on the gate was louder, more entitled, more personal. They started treating my home like it was theirs to inspect, and me like a problem to be fixed. But what they didn't realize, what none of them saw coming, was that I don't scare easily. So when their president stepped 1 foot too far onto my property, I decided it was time to teach him what trespassing really means. You ever wonder what happens when the people who crave control push the wrong person too far? Stay with me, because this story doesn't just end with justice. It ends with the kind of payback you can feel in your bones. I bought the ranch for one reason: peace. Real, bone-deep, soul-healing peace. After years in construction management, listening to the grind of machines and the endless hum of city life, I wanted nothing more than a stretch of open land where I could breathe again. The property sat on the edge of a sprawling suburban development, a strange blend of wilderness and regulation. My land wasn't part of the new community, or so I thought. When I signed the deed, there was no mention of any homeowners association, no hidden agreements, no small print suggesting someone else would have a say in what I did on my own soil. It was mine. 10 acres of fenced pasture, an old red barn, a weathered farmhouse, and a herd of cattle that had been grazing there long before I came along. The mornings were my favorite. The first light would roll over the fields, the sound of distant birds echoing through the oak trees, and the dew would glisten on the fence line like glass. I'd sip my coffee on the porch, boots propped on the railing, watching my cattle move slow and steady through the mist. There was something sacred about that stillness, the kind of quiet that money couldn't buy and rules couldn't touch. At least that's what I believed. Until the day the first letter showed up. It was crisp, perfectly folded, slipped under my gate like a summons. The envelope was stamped with the logo of the Oak Ridge Meadows Homeowners Association. Inside, a polite but firm notice. Dear resident, it has come to our attention that your fencing style does not conform to community standards. Please refer to Section 4A of the HOA covenant regarding uniform fence aesthetics. I actually laughed. I thought it was a mistake. Oak Ridge Meadows was the subdivision across the road, a maze of freshly paved streets, cookie-cutter houses, and manicured lawns where every mailbox looked the same. I was the opposite of that world. My ranch was older, wilder, authentic. Surely this was a mix-up. But a few days later, another letter came. This one was bolder, less polite. Failure to comply may result in fines. That got my attention. I called the number at the bottom, expecting a quick resolution, but the voice that answered was something else entirely. Clipped, cold, and bureaucratic. This is Richard Hollis, president of the Oak Ridge Meadows HOA. I assure you, sir, your property falls within the community boundary lines. You're required to maintain compliance just like everyone else. I told him flat out that was impossible. My property was listed as agricultural land, not residential. He didn't care. He spoke with a kind of smug authority that made my blood run hot. We'll be sending someone by to assess, he said before hanging up. And that's how it began. the slow erosion of my peace, one letter, one visit, one intrusion at a time. The first visit came from Richard himself. Late morning, white polo shirt, khaki shorts, and that HOA badge hanging around his neck like a sheriff's star. He parked his shiny black SUV right outside my gate, clipboard in hand, and waved like we were neighbors just catching up. I met him at the fence, coffee still in hand. He talked about community standards and property values, using that overly polite tone that people use when they think they're in charge. I told him again that this was private land. He smiled, but there was something in his eyes, something calculating. "We'll see about that," he said before leaving. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. Cars from the subdivision slowing down near my gate. People I didn't recognize walking along my property line, pretending to take a jog but always stopping to peer in. Then came the photos, printed, glossy images of my property taped to another letter. Noncompliance continues. Corrective action required. Still, I tried to ignore it. I figured it would blow over. But Oak Ridge Meadows wasn't just any neighborhood. It was a place built on control. Every hedge trimmed the same height, every garage door painted the same shade of beige, every resident trained to believe conformity was the same as pride. Richard Hollis ran it like a personal kingdom, and his board was a loyal court of petty tyrants. There was Denise, the treasurer, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who never smiled without calculation. She handled the fines and notices, and word was she kept meticulous records almost obsessively. Then there was Tom, the so-called landscape chair, who lived 3 houses from the entrance and treated every blade of grass like it was part of his personal domain. And finally, there was Nancy, the secretary, who didn't speak much but wrote everything down. Every conversation, every incident, every whisper of noncompliance. They were the kind of people who believed rules mattered more than reason, and they'd found their next target. At first, it was laughable. They cited me for having livestock visible from the road, then for the color of my barn, then for improper fencing. Each letter came with an attached fine, escalating every week. I didn't pay a cent. I wasn't part of their association, and I wasn't about to start pretending I was. But as the weeks passed, their persistence turned invasive. I'd catch Richard parked on the roadside, staring through binoculars. One morning, I woke up to find a fresh notice of violation stapled directly to my gatepost. They were escalating, testing me, waiting to see how far they could go before I broke. I started doing my own digging. The county assessor's office confirmed what I already knew. My ranch wasn't part of the Oak Ridge Meadows development. It was technically adjacent, not included in the HOA's plat. But when I mentioned that to Richard, he dismissed it entirely. "Boundaries are complicated," he said, smirking. "We interpret the regulations broadly." That word, but us interpret, told me everything. This wasn't about legality. It was about power. By late spring, the letters had turned into threats. Unpaid fines may result in a lien being placed on your property. I knew that wasn't legally possible, but it still made my chest tighten. I wasn't rich, but everything I had was tied up in this ranch. I'd poured my savings, my sweat, and years of my life into restoring it. The barn, the fencing, the grazing pasture, every inch of it was mine. And yet, this group of suburban enforcers had decided to make it their battleground. The emotional weight of it started to creep in quietly. I stopped sleeping well. Every noise outside jolted me awake, half expecting to find another notice tacked to my door. The peace that had once defined my mornings was slipping away, replaced by a low, constant hum of tension. My neighbors, the real ones, the ones who'd been here long before Oak Ridge Meadows existed, warned me to be careful. They said the HOA was notorious for pushing people out. A farmer down the road had fought them once over drainage rights, and within months, they'd buried him in so much paperwork and court summonses that he sold his land just to escape. I didn't want to believe it could happen to me. But then came the day I found tire tracks inside my gate, deep ruts cutting through the mud, heading straight toward my barn. Someone had come in without permission. I checked the cameras, but the footage was gone, wiped. That's when the fear turned into something else, something sharper, anger. From that moment on, I started documenting everything. Every letter, every conversation, every photograph. I set up new cameras, hidden ones this time. I logged every incident with timestamps. I wasn't going to let them gaslight me the way they had others. If they wanted a fight, I was going to give them one. But I'd do it on my terms. The following week, Richard called again, this time sounding irritated. He accused me of tampering with community signage. Apparently, a Welcome to Oak Ridge Meadows sign near the main road had been painted over with the words, "Private land. Stay out." I hadn't done it, but I couldn't help but smile at the thought. He warned me that continued non-cooperation would result in further enforcement. That night, I stood on my porch, the warm air thick with summer, and stared at the glowing lights of the subdivision across the road. Their streets were perfect, identical, suffocating. Mine was quiet-free, a little wild. Two worlds divided by one fence, and the people on the other side couldn't stand that mine didn't bow to theirs. The next morning, I found a notice nailed directly to my barn door. It was from the HOA, official letterhead and all, but this one wasn't just about fines. It was a final warning. It stated that representatives would be conducting an on-site assessment to determine compliance. Translation, they were coming onto my property without my permission. And that was the moment the first real line was drawn. Because if there's one thing I can't tolerate, it's trespassers. Especially the kind who think rules give them power over what they don't own. At that point, I still had no idea how far they were willing to go, how bold, how reckless, how entitled. But I was about to find out. And once they crossed that fence, nothing would ever be the same again. It started quietly, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful anymore, but heavy, charged, like the calm before a storm that's been waiting for the right gust of wind. After the final warning was nailed to my barn door, I didn't hear from the HOA for almost 2 weeks. No calls, no letters, no surprise visits, just silence. And that silence made me uneasy. Every morning, I'd walk the perimeter, checking my fences and cameras, scanning for tire tracks or footprints. The land felt different now, not free and open like it once did, but watched. The stillness of the pasture wasn't soothing anymore. It was tense, like the land itself knew someone was about to cross a line. Then, one Tuesday morning, I found them. Richard Hollis, the HOA president, and 2 board members met parked right inside my gate, clipboards in hand, wearing neon vests like they were conducting a government inspection. My gate chain had been cut clean through, left dangling. They were standing by the cattle pen, pointing, whispering, jotting down notes. I shouted before I even got out of the truck, but Richard barely flinched. He turned, calm as ever, and said, "We're here for the scheduled property evaluation." Scheduled, as if I'd ever agreed to it. My hands shook with anger. I told them to get off my land, but Richard smiled that same smug smile he always wore, the kind that made my blood boil. "You're obstructing a lawful inspection," he said, like he was reciting from a script. "That's another violation." I stepped closer, boots crunching over gravel, and told him the truth, that if he didn't leave in 10 seconds, I'd consider it trespassing. His face shifted for the first time. That little flicker of fear I'd been waiting to see finally cracked through. They left, but not before snapping photos of my barn, my fence, my livestock, even my private property signs. By the next morning, I had a certified letter taped to my mailbox. It listed every infraction they'd found: non-conforming fencing, unapproved livestock, and unauthorized signage. Each one came with a fine. Total due, $2,750, and this time they didn't send it as a courtesy notice. They marked it as enforceable debt. I spent hours pacing that day, reading the letter over and over, until I could feel the paper softening in my hands. How could people who didn't own this land think they could fine me for living on it? It felt surreal, like a bad dream you can't wake up from. But that was their tactic: bury you in absurdity until you either surrender or break. And they weren't done. Within a week, the subdivision gossip mill turned into an army. I started noticing unfamiliar faces at the edge of my property. People walking dogs that didn't belong to them, lingering too long by my gate, snapping photos like amateur spies. Then came the drones, small buzzing things that hovered over my fields, dipping low enough to spook my cattle. I followed one back to a white SUV idling near the subdivision entrance. Richard again. He didn't even hide it. The pettiness turned systemic. Every small thing I did became another infraction. I parked my truck on the hour grass. Improper vehicle storage. I repaired my fence. Unauthorized alteration to property. Boundary. Even the windmill I'd restored for irrigation became a target. Unapproved structure visible from public view. It was madness, and every notice came with a new fine. I stopped counting after 10. Then came the nosy neighbor, Harold from Lot 22. He was the self-appointed eyes and ears of Oak Ridge Meadows, retired Air Force, and proud of it. He started showing up near my fence almost daily, pretending to take his morning walk, but always managing to accidentally film my property. Once I caught him leaning against my gate, squinting through binoculars. When I confronted him, he told me he was assisting the board by documenting my non-compliance. His smugness reminded me of Richard, the same type who needed a sense of control to feel important. I told him if he came onto my land again, I'd call the sheriff. He chuckled and said, "The HOA has more pull around here than the sheriff." That was the first time I realized just how deep their influence ran. Everywhere I turned, they were tightening the noose. The letters escalated from warnings to threats. They claimed they were initiating proceedings to secure compliance. They sent a notice saying they'd vote to extend jurisdiction over my land through a community annexation clause. When I called my attorney, even he was baffled. "That's not how annexation works," he said, "but they're probably counting on you not knowing that." It was psychological warfare, death by paperwork and paranoia. My mailbox became a weapon. Each envelope carried another threat, another reminder that I was outnumbered. Even the local hardware store clerk started giving me strange looks, probably because Denise, the HOA treasurer, worked there part-time and made sure everyone knew I was that guy fighting the association. The isolation started to seep in. My friends stopped visiting. The local feed supplier stopped delivering after the HOA notified them of zoning issues. It wasn't just about my land anymore. They were trying to choke me out socially, economically, mentally. Then came the hidden bylaw discovery. One night, after another long evening sorting through their letters, I found an old PDF on the county's public records site, the original Oak Ridge Meadows Charter. Buried deep inside was a clause about transitional buffer properties. It stated that properties adjacent to the HOA boundary could be subject to aesthetic influence zones. Basically, if your land could be seen from the subdivision, the HOA could claim authority over its visual conformity. It was vague, almost laughably so, but it was the weapon they were using against me. They were exploiting a legal gray area to justify harassment. I started to document everything even more obsessively. Every visit, every letter, every photograph. I created a digital archive organized by date and category. I knew it wouldn't stop them, but it gave me purpose, a way to fight back without losing my mind. But even that small control didn't last long. One afternoon, while I was mending a fence near the west pasture, I saw movement by the barn. A man I didn't recognize, clipboard in hand, wearing a neon vest, walking through my property like he owned it. I ran over, shouting, but he barely looked up. "I'm with the HOA Compliance Division," he said. "We're conducting a boundary review." My chest tightened. "You're trespassing," I told him. He shrugged. "Community enforcement rights override private exclusion." Those words burned into my brain. When I demanded ID, he walked off toward his car, mumbling something about reporting aggressive behavior. The next day, another letter arrived. Notice of incident. Aggression toward HOA. Representative. They accused me of verbal intimidation and obstructing compliance. A $1,000 fine was added to my account. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh, but it was a hollow kind of laugh, the kind that comes when you're too tired to scream. By midsummer, I'd racked up over $10,000 in so-called fines. Richard started emailing now, his tone smug and condescending. "You can resolve these matters amicably by attending the next HOA board meeting," he wrote. "Failure to appear will result in escalation." I had no reason to go. I wasn't one of them. But something in me needed to look those people in the eyes. I needed to see what kind of arrogance could fuel this much cruelty. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, one of those spotless, soulless buildings that looked like it was designed to host bake sales and revolutions alike. As I walked in, the chatter died instantly. Every head turned. Richard sat at the front table, flanked by Denise and Tom, papers neatly stacked before them like they were holding court. "Mr. Callahan," Richard said with a thin smile, "we appreciate your attendance." I stood at the back, arms crossed. They read off their list of grievances: fences, livestock, signage, tone of correspondence. Denise clicked her pen every time a new fine was mentioned. Tom nodded solemnly, pretending to care. When I presented my county records proving I wasn't under their jurisdiction, Richard waved it off. "We interpret community lines dynamically," he said again, that smug phrase he loved so much. I told them flat out that if they set foot on my property again, I'd file for harassment and trespassing. His smile faltered, but only for a second. "We'll take that under advisement," he said. When I walked out, I felt eyes burning into my back. The next morning, someone had dumped a bag of trash at my gate. HOA flyers, torn envelopes, even one of their letters crumpled and smeared with mud. The message was clear. They weren't backing down. From then on, things started breaking. My mailbox was smashed twice. My front gate lock was cut 3 more times. My irrigation system was mysteriously damaged. Pipes snapped clean, as if cut deliberately. Even my cattle grew restless, spooked by sudden loud noises at night. When I checked the cameras, I caught flashes of headlights in movement, vehicles stopping just beyond the fence, figures getting out, then disappearing into the dark. I took it all to the sheriff's office, but they brushed it off. "It's a civil matter," they said. "Talk to the HOA." That's when the hopelessness began to sink in. They'd boxed me in on every side, legally, socially, even psychologically. The land that once brought me peace now felt like a battlefield. Every corner held evidence of their reach. Every sound at night set my teeth on edge. But under that exhaustion, a fire started to build, quiet at first, but growing. Because no matter how hard they pushed, I wasn't leaving. They wanted to break me, to make an example out of me. But I'd come too far to roll over, and then they made their biggest mistake. A realtor showed up one morning, smiling, clipboard in hand, asking if she could tour the property. I asked what she was talking about. She said the HOA had listed my ranch as a potential acquisition for redevelopment, and that she'd been invited by the board to assess its condition. My heart dropped. They were trying to sell my land, as if it already belonged to them. That was the moment everything changed. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "You tell them this property's not for sale, and if they try stepping on it again, they'll find out exactly how private this land really is." Then I walked over to my gate, dragged the heavy steel chain through the latch, and locked it tight. I posted my own sign beside the road. Big, bold letters on fresh wood. "Private land. Trespassers will be confined until authorities arrive." The message wasn't subtle, and that was the point, because from that moment on, this wasn't about fences or bylaws or fines anymore. It was about something far older, far simpler. A man's right to defend what's his, and I had no idea just how far they'd push me to prove it. It began on a Sunday. Quiet. Too quiet, like the air was holding its breath. The kind of morning where even the birds seemed to hesitate before singing. I was standing on my porch with a mug of coffee gone cold, watching the horizon bleed pale gold over the fence line, when I saw them. A convoy of SUVs rolling down the gravel road, kicking up a plume of dust that glowed like smoke in the dawn light. They moved with purpose, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. And at the front, leading them like a general, was Richard Hollis. Even from a distance, I could see that damn clipboard in his hand. By the time they reached my gate, there were 6 vehicles in total. HOA board members, a few residents, even a man in a county jacket who didn't look like he wanted to be there. They parked in a neat line, blocking the road like they owned it. Richard got out first, fixing his tie like he was about to give a press conference. "Mr. Callahan," he called out, voice echoing through the still air, "we're here to execute a compliance order." You've been officially annexed into the Oak Ridge Meadows Association. Annexed. The word hit like a bullet. I walked down the drive, boots grinding on gravel, heart hammering against my ribs. You can't annex private land, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You don't have jurisdiction here, and you damn well know it. Richard smiled, that smug, poisonous smile, the kind that made you want to rip it off his face. We have the paperwork, he said, lifting the clipboard, approved by a special session of the board and recognized by the county zoning committee. He gestured to the man in the county jacket, who shifted uncomfortably but didn't say a word. Behind them, the others started unloading equipment, stakes, signs, even rolls of orange plastic fencing. They were planning to mark my property as part of the HOA. Right then, right there, my throat tightened and something deep in my chest snapped, a soundless, invisible break. I stepped forward until I was face to face with Richard. You set 1 foot past that gate, and it's trespassing, I said. And this time I won't just file a report, I'll make sure you don't forget it. He didn't flinch. Instead, he waved his hand, and 2 of his cronies moved toward the gate with bolt cutters. The sound of metal grinding against metal sliced through the silence. My pulse surged. I could feel every muscle in my body coil tight, ready to explode. Don't do it, I said, voice low and steady, but my hands were trembling. They cut the chain. The gate swung open with a slow, heavy creak. That was it. The line crossed. The point of no return. I didn't think. I just acted. I grabbed my phone and hit record. I filmed everything. The men stepping onto my land, the signs going up, the county officials standing by without a word. You're being recorded, I said loud enough for everyone to hear. Every single one of you is committing criminal trespass. Richard turned, irritated now, his perfect composure cracking. You're obstructing an authorized operation, he barked. Authorized by who? I shot back. A pack of power-drunk neighbors who think they're the government? He sneered. By the law. But I already knew he was bluffing, because the night before I'd filed my own paperwork, hours on the phone with a property rights attorney who specialized in HOA overreach. I'd sent in a cease and desist letter, certified, time-stamped, and backed by state code. The ink wasn't even dry yet, and I had one more ace up my sleeve, a local news contact who'd been following my case quietly for months. I turned my phone toward the line of vehicles and said, You might want to smile, Richard. Channel 8's going to love this footage. That got his attention. His face blanched, eyes darting toward the others. But it was too late. I'd already sent the live feed link. Within minutes, my video was streaming on social media. Neighbors started coming out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. Some looked confused, others curious. A few, the ones who'd been whispering about me for months, looked furious that I was making this public. Richard tried to recover. This man is spreading misinformation, he announced, loud and theatrical. He's in violation of multiple community codes. But his voice trembled, and his carefully built authority began to crack. Then, like something out of a movie, 2 sheriff's cruisers pulled up, sirens off, lights flashing soft blue against the dust. My chest flooded with adrenaline. Finally, someone was here to see the truth. The deputies stepped out, hands resting on their belts. One of them, a tall man with weathered eyes, asked, What's going on here? Richard straightened his tie again. We're enforcing a compliance order, he said quickly. This man's property is now under HOA jurisdiction. The deputy looked at me, then at the gate, then at the line of SUVs. He live here? Yes, I said, and they just broke in. I handed him my phone, showing the footage, the letter, the timestamps. Everything's documented. The deputy studied it for a long moment, then turned back to Richard. You got a court order for this annexation? Richard hesitated. It's been approved through internal... The deputy cut him off. That's not a court order. You could have heard a pin drop. The crowd of neighbors shifted uneasily. The county man took a half step back, muttering something about procedural misunderstanding. Then the deputy said the words I'd been waiting to hear for months. Sir, if you and your people don't leave this property immediately, you'll be cited for trespassing. Richard's face turned red, the kind of red that looks like it's about to boil over. You don't understand? No, the deputy said, firm now. You don't understand. This is private land. You've got no authority here. "Now, pack it up," the board members started murmuring, unsure, looking at each other for direction. But Richard couldn't let go. "This man's been non-compliant for months," he snapped. "He's refused to follow community standards." The deputy stepped forward. "He's not part of your community," he said flatly. End of discussion. That was it. The mighty president of the Oak Ridge Meadows HOA, standing there in the dirt, watching everything he'd built crumble under the weight of his own arrogance. His hand shook. His mouth opened, then closed again. No words left. Just rage. When they finally left, it wasn't clean. They threw accusations, threats, promises of legal action. Richard tore one of his own signs off the fence and hurled it into the road. But none of it mattered. Because for the first time, they were the ones retreating. I watched them go, dust trailing behind their cars, fading into the horizon. My knees nearly gave out. Months of tension, fear and anger, all of it crashing into one dizzying release. I leaned against the gate, feeling the sun rise warm against my back, and I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. But even as the quiet returned, I knew this wasn't over, because power like theirs doesn't vanish. It festers. It hides behind paperwork and polished smiles, waiting for the next chance to strike. And sure enough, 2 days later, a new envelope arrived. Thick. Certified. The HOA had filed a civil suit against me for defamation and interference with community governance. They wanted damages, tens of thousands. It was their last weapon, the courtroom. But what they didn't expect was that the video had gone viral. Overnight, my story spread, headlines calling it "The HOA Gone Too Far." Journalists dug into the board's finances, uncovering years of shady dealings, misused funds, illegal annexation attempts, backroom deals with developers. Within a week, the county announced a full investigation. Within a month, the HOA board was suspended pending legal review, and Richard Hollis? He resigned quietly, citing stress-related health issues. When I finally stood before the county review committee, my hands no longer shook. I handed them every document, every recording, every scrap of evidence I'd gathered. They nodded, somber, almost embarrassed. One official said softly, "Mr. Callahan, you've done this community a service." It didn't feel like victory. Not yet. Victory isn't loud or satisfying. It's quiet. It's standing on your porch after the storm has passed, the wind still heavy with the scent of rain, knowing you survived something that should have broken you. Months later, the land was mine again, uncontested, unclaimed, unbothered. The signs were gone, the fences repaired, the mailbox standing tall. But something inside me had changed. I wasn't just defending property anymore. I was defending the principle that no one, no board, no committee, no self-appointed authority has the right to strip away a person's dignity under the guise of rules. Sometimes I still drive past the entrance to Oak Ridge Meadows. The fancy sign is gone now, replaced by a plain one that simply says Oak Ridge, no mention of the HOA. The lawns are a little less perfect, the mailboxes mismatched. But there's something beautiful about that imperfection. It feels real, human, free. Every so often, I get messages from strangers, people dealing with their own HOA nightmares, asking how I fought back, how I won. I tell them the truth. It wasn't about winning. It was about not giving up, about standing your ground when everyone tells you to fold, about knowing that sometimes doing what's right means making a whole lot of enemies. And when the wind sweeps across my land at dusk, carrying the rustle of grass and the hum of the windmill, I remember that morning, the SUVs, the clipboards, the gate swinging open, and I smile. Because that was the day they learned something I already knew. You can fine a man. You can threaten him. You can bury him in paper and law and noise, but you can't take what he's willing to fight for. Not ever. The morning after the final hearing felt almost unreal. For the first time in over a year, I woke up without dread sitting heavy on my chest. No envelopes taped to my fence. No citations tucked under my windshield. No emails from the HOA threatening further legal action. Just the quiet hum of wind over the open fields and the gentle creak of the porch boards as I stepped outside. The air was lighter, not just in the way it smelled or moved, but in the way it felt against my skin. Like the land itself was exhaling after being held hostage for too long. When the county court officially ruled that the annexation was null and void, it did more than clear my name. It cracked something wide open in Oak Ridge. The story had spread like wildfire. Local news anchors called it the HOA overreach that backfired, but the headlines didn't capture the truth of it, the human ripple that followed. Neighbors who'd once avoided me started reaching out, quietly at first, a nod at the grocery store, a small wave at the stoplight. Then came the messages, the calls. I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. They threatened to fine us too, but we were scared to speak up. One older couple even confessed that Richard had pressured them into voting for new restrictions by threatening to review their landscaping. The illusion of order that Oak Ridge had been built on was collapsing, one secret at a time. Within weeks, more homeowners started attending HOA meetings, not the carefully staged ones the board used to control, but real gatherings where people asked hard questions, where the minutes were recorded and posted publicly, where transparency wasn't just a buzzword. I watched from a distance, no longer part of their world, but I could feel the shift like a current in the air. For the first time, the residents were no longer afraid. Then the investigation reports came out. Misused funds, forged signatures, unauthorized expansions of HOA boundaries, even hush payments to a local inspector. It was all there, laid bare in black and white. The fallout was swift and brutal. Richard Hollis and 2 other board members were indicted on charges of fraud and misappropriation of funds. The HOA bank account was frozen. A temporary administrator was assigned to oversee dissolution proceedings. It didn't happen overnight. Justice never does. But it came, steady and certain. I remember standing in that same courthouse months later, the same one where Richard once smirked as his lawyer tried to bury me in legal jargon. But now he sat 2 rows ahead, smaller somehow, his once perfect posture deflated. The judge read out the final ruling: restitution, community service, permanent disqualification from serving on any residential board again. I didn't cheer. I didn't gloat. I just closed my eyes for a moment and let the sound of the gavel sink in. That sound, sharp, final, was the punctuation mark on a chapter I never wanted to write, but couldn't avoid living. After that, Oak Ridge changed. The community, once obsessed with appearances and order, started breathing differently. The lawns grew a little wilder. The houses started to look less like postcards and more like homes. Kids played in driveways again. Someone even painted their front door bright red, a color that would have earned an instant citation a year ago. Now it stood like a quiet rebellion, a declaration of independence. I'd get visits sometimes, people asking how to start fresh, how to untangle themselves from contracts they never truly understood. And I'd tell them, you start by remembering it's your home, not theirs. My land, meanwhile, flourished. The grass grew back over the scars left by their fences. The cattle roamed freely again, unbothered by signs or inspectors. I rebuilt the old barn, the one they once claimed violated aesthetic uniformity. This time, I painted it a deep, unapologetic rust red. Every nail I drove in felt like reclaiming something stolen, not just wood and land, but peace. The media eventually moved on to new stories, new scandals. But every once in a while someone would mention mine, a whisper in a podcast, a headline resurfacing online. The rancher who took down an HOA. It always made me chuckle. They made it sound heroic, but truth be told, it wasn't heroism. It was survival. One afternoon, months after the dust had truly settled, I found myself standing by the cattle pen, the same one where Richard Hollis had once stood, red-faced and shouting threats. The sun was low, painting everything in gold. The air was still. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: quiet pride. Not the loud, boastful kind. The kind that hums deep in your bones when you know you did something that mattered, even if it cost you. Later, I walked into town. The local cafe, once filled with whispers whenever I entered, now greeted me with nods and handshakes. The barista, a young woman I barely knew, smiled as she handed me my coffee. "You're the reason they disbanded the HOA, right?" she said. I shrugged, but she smiled wider. Good. Someone needed to do it. It struck me then how one fight, one stubborn refusal to back down, could ripple out far beyond the boundaries of a single fence. I wasn't just reclaiming land. I was proving a point that systems built on control crumble when people stop playing by their rules. The irony was that Richard's obsession with control had destroyed everything he'd built. The HOA that once ruled Oak Ridge was gone. Its bylaws were erased from the county records. The name Oak Ridge Meadows Homeowners Association existed only in lawsuits and archived documents. What remained was just Oak Ridge, plain, imperfect, real. And, for me, the victory wasn't about the property or the money or even the public vindication. It was about freedom, the kind that can't be measured on paper. The kind that lives in the quiet moments when you realize no one's watching your every move. No one's policing the shade of your fence. No one's dictating how you live your life. Months later, I got a letter in the mail. No fines, no threats, just a handwritten note from an older woman who still lived in Oak Ridge. She thanked me for standing up, said her husband had been too afraid to challenge the board, but now felt hope again. We planted a garden, she wrote, in the front yard. They would have fined us for that before. Now the neighbors come by to admire it. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it in my desk drawer. That simple message meant more than any verdict or news headline ever could. It meant something had truly changed. Sometimes, late at night, I'd replay everything in my mind. The warnings, the fines, the confrontations, the endless stress. It all seemed so far away now, like a storm seen from the distance, after it's already passed. But I could still feel the lessons it carved into me. That piece isn't handed to you. It's fought for. Earned, defended inch by inch, no matter the cost. And maybe that's what this story was always about. Not revenge, not victory, but resilience. About refusing to let fear dictate what's right. About showing that one person armed with truth and stubbornness can dismantle an entire system built on intimidation.